Friends, partners, hosts, and honored guests, it is indeed a great pleasure and an honor to be with you today to celebrate and take part in ERF's 25th annual conference. Some of you I have met before, and many of you are new to me, but it is wonderful to be here on this occasion. As I am here today on behalf of the International Development Research Centre, a Canadian organization established in 1970, whose mandate is indeed to initiate, support, and conduct research into the problems of developing regions. We are a global organization with offices in Africa, in Asia, in South America, and in the Middle East and North Africa. Compared to others, IDRC is indeed small. We don't work alone, but in partnerships, and we strive to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We have indeed been a steady, if small, supporter of ERF in the form of project and core funding for many years. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that the major issues of international development of the modern world are being played out in the region of the Middle East and North Africa today. These issues include climate change, inequality and exclusion, population displacement and migration, technological disruption, and geopolitical upheaval and conflict. Everywhere and in this region, it is time for new ideas and fresh ideas and old ideas reborn. And never has the relevance of research, knowledge, good data, and serious understanding of complex issues been more important. Today, I would like to share with you some insights into these challenges through the lens of fragility. These insights come from leading researchers in the region who attended a meeting last week hosted by IDRC in Amman. They concern many of these issues, but they also concern the challenges and difficulties and imperatives facing researchers and research institutions in this region today. At this meeting in Amman, fragility was indeed recognized as central and relevant to the development of the region today. As one participant noted, all but 4 countries of the Middle East and North Africa exhibit symptoms of fragility in terms of weak governance, conflict, internal conflict, an inability to provide basic services for their citizens, loss of legitimacy, among other symptoms. The major issues that our colleagues in Amman noted are ones that we have already referred to today. Over and over again, the issue of governance. Lack of good governance being the major impediment to almost every issue of development. Major and fundamental reforms being required across a spectrum of governance fields: political, social, economic, and security. These failures of governance were challenged by the many movements of the Arab Spring in 2011, and that was a major expression of popular frustration. Unfortunately, this has been followed by acts of repression by various governments and a resurgence and nostalgia for autocratic and authoritarian rule in some countries. But the latter is a temporary phase in the view of some of our participants, with governance issues still unresolved, continued popular frustration, and the unsustainability, as Professor Collier and others have noted, of the rentier political economies based on oil revenues. Particular concern was raised about the relationship between the state and society, concern about the repression of popular voices and the means of popular organization, about controls of the media, laws to discourage dissent, and that undermine free inquiry, that manipulate populist fears. The state focus on security instead of development and the well-being of its citizens was another major concern. The second big issue was the political economies in transition, again, as Professor Collier and others have noted, from systems that were dependent directly or indirectly on oil revenues. These entrenched rentier systems of government have created a culture of dependence and patronage and have suppressed creativity and productivity. And as our participants noted, they have suppressed these this creativity and productivity not only in government, but also in business. And they are incapable of dealing with the modern issues of these societies. The decline in oil revenues means rentier systems will not, in the long run, be able to sustain themselves, although they will indeed be hard to transition as vested interests are powerful and will likely cling on. The feeling among some participants was that transition will happen, but how and when and with what turmoil. Also of note in this region that some economies and societies are in transition from war. They require will and do require massive reconstruction, rebuilding, reorganizing in major and difficult ways. The third issue was the issue of education. The question of education for skills and for the private use by the private sector and public policy development was granted as being important, but another element was also emphasized: the importance of education for values, to create a generation of critical thinkers, of people who are adaptable, creative, flexible, and have the skills of life to cope with the fast-moving, uncertain, and competitive style of modern economies. This means more than computers, more than rote learning, curriculum adjustments, and more than skills training for specific vocations or digitized economies, although of course these specific skills are very important as well. There's concern that the universities in many ways are failing, that school systems are failing, and all require complex transformation and redirection. This question of education was seen as underpinning all possibilities of reform and positive change. Another concern is conflict resolution at local and international level to stop, reverse, or resolve conflicts that are violent and destructive and self-perpetuating because they have been and continue to be linked to ethnic, religious, or political identity and vulnerability. And that these conflicts are perpetuated both international meddling and proxy manipulation, but also entrenched by rigid and incapable local ideologies and governance systems. Another issue is migration and population displacement, refugees across borders, internal displacement within countries. Recognition that 50% of the world's refugees live in the Middle East and North Africa. Reference also to rural-urban migration, the congestion of cities. Professor Collier has noted the importance of cities in modern economies. They are fast outpacing, their growth is fast outpacing the capacities of infrastructure and well-being to create prosperous economies. Reference to migrant labor, the neglect of rural regions, the phrase urban misery, rural hopelessness was raised. The population movements have exacerbated development challenges in terms of social and political stability, social service provision, interethnic competition, security, and economic growth. These phenomena are poorly understood, but they are critical to development of the region. The other issue raised over and over again was gender inequality and exclusion, intersecting into inequalities of gender and other diversities, entrenched by local family law requiring reform, by outdated norms and vested interests. Positive and negative developments were recognized in terms of gender empowerment. More women in positions of political leadership, but new repressive measures and challenges are being made in terms of education, social mobility, and gender identity, among other matters. The other issue, major issue of development, environmental. In our group in Amman, they were framed often in terms of issues like water scarcity and pollution, and referenced often in terms of the failures of governance. Climate change as such was referred to somewhat peripherally. I'm not sure why. Was this because our partners in the room traditionally have focused on social, economic, and political issues? Or is it because water scarcity has been endemic to the regions for so long So there may be a blind spot about the critical issues of today in terms of climate change. The last big issue I would highlight is the digital and technological disruption. Participants recognized the liberating features of modern technology in terms of individuals and groups learning and exchanging and organizing themselves to claim rights, show dissent, and/or question the entrenched systems of governance that are failing. Also for business growth, youth employment, economic transitions, improved education, and better health outcomes. But major concerns were expressed about the use of data for surveillance, repression, social control, and the concentration of wealth. Also about the fragmentation of societies, about the divorce of groups engaged in digital learning or digital consultation, and their divorce from government and from each other that digitization can also foster. Participants in Oman noted in this context a number of research gaps, defined often across these major issues. They felt, however, that the current challenge of development more
الصوت هون على الصوت.
may not be able to be asked, are not necessarily able to be asked. Universities are not training adequately or producing researchers or thought leaders in sufficient numbers. There is need for space to think about issues more deeply. The second issue or challenge was fragmentation. A concern that there was insufficient collaboration across the region between institutions, individuals. Participants reflected a sense of isolation from each other, from global institutions, and from those in other parts of the world. Again, these issues have been raised by others, and I think it's a priority and a concern of ERF as it goes forward. Research agendas can be pushed by faraway donor-driven agendas or Western national agendas not necessarily relevant to local development challenges and distracting from important subjects. Participants felt pressure to study certain trendy topics or produce and collect data for others, to take risks for others, often to the exclusion of inquiries more relevant to the major issues of the region. There is research waste. Research that is generated in MENA is not necessarily always useful. This applies to many parts of the world, of course, not just MENA, or used. Research groups may not be good at advocacy or influencing policymakers, even if they can produce and generate good knowledge and evidence that could contribute to better policies on critical issues of development and governance. And the gender implications of research may not be recognized or else are neglected. These are issues in terms of methodology, power relations, poor recognition of how women and girls are affected by big transitions, such as migration. In relation to these challenges and these development issues, research communities in MENA were urged, therefore, to consider certain approaches. One, research that includes number crunching, but also goes beyond it, that includes qualitative as well as quantitative research, that makes for dialogues on development matters, that are alternatives to cookie-cutter research approaches, research that builds specifically on local context, local norms, local concerns, action research, evaluations, special methods, research that keeps its eyes open for a variety of means and styles and approaches. Professor Collier has noted how change really happens slowly, and one can learn from mistakes and one can learn from successes, that a cookie-cutter approach imposed by somewhere else, or policies imposed, or research done in the name of justifying certain policies can either be a waste of time or actually detract from positive development outcomes. Participants called for research that links the local to the global and the global to the local, that links and cross-cuts borders, sectors, and institutions locally and regionally. Research that compares, that enables individuals and organizations and communities of practice to learn from each other, that supports local bodies of knowledge and also recognizes different ways of knowing and doing and seeing. The group called for research that has policy relevance. That has policy relevance. That has policy relevance for governments and international organizations. To answer questions, and these are not necessarily, these two questions are actually can be in contradiction. What aid and intervention from the international community is truly useful and truly relevant? And what measures will be useful to further in positive ways the transitions that our societies are undergoing? Participant called for everyone to look more closely at the consumers as well as the producers of research and tailor research accordingly. The group called for research that develops homegrown solutions framed in terms of critical, context-specific questions. It called for research interventions that build capacity for better and more rigorous inquiry methods, for better transmission of ideas, for knowledge creation and use. It called for core funding that can bring stability to local organizations so they can retain talent and build long-term expertise and long-term relationships critical to the modern contested world. It called for research that explores and builds knowledge for the long term, not only for quick fixes and simplistic policy solutions or technical answers framed in a narrow way, for research that goes to critical root issues that are complex in nature. The group called for research into success as well as failure, into systems and solutions that work as well as those that don't. There's lots to learn and understand from these. There's lots to learn in the region, and there's lots for the rest of the world to learn from this region. And finally, it called for the gendered impact to look more seriously at the gendered impact of research. This question of mainstreaming gender should be considered seriously in the design, methodologies, collection of data, and use of knowledge. Now, where does our ERF come in? ERF comes in across this world, of course, in many important ways. It's easy to see how important ERF, as a network, as a major leading researcher on tackling the big issues of economics and public policy, in the way it tackles the socio-economic issues, including those triggered by migration and displacement, youth vulnerability, equity, and exclusion. It's obvious to see that ERF as a leader in using and promoting the use of data and statistics and working with statistical offices and promoting and exploring how these can better be used to underpin good public policy. The way ERF works is important too. Under the new direction of Mr. El-Badawi, we can see ERF's commitment to young researchers regionally with fellowships and grants, and by including them in opportunities to meet and share their knowledge. Also, as Mr. El-Badawi has said, a strong emphasis on encouraging young women researchers. ERF is and can continue to be committed to the development of regional research capacity and policy. As our partners noted last week, networks in the Middle East and beyond are critical, and networks and the establishment of communities of practice is not done sufficiently, but indeed is a priority for ERF at the moment and going forward. ERF is pursuing new ways of communicating with its online platform and other efforts. It will be interesting to hear how this is going, and a possible example to others, very promising. The big question for everyone doing research is how that research is used and how it can influence for the public good, policymakers and decision makers. This remains an ongoing challenge all over the world, and I would say particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. It's a challenge faced by ERF, and it's a challenge that is faced by almost every research institution and individual in this region. We don't have the answers, but we do know that organizations like ERF are critical and important to moving forward in this very critical period for this region. Thank you.